Opening the center immediately creates dynamic play and stakes a claim for early initiative. France beckons, preparing for solid central play and potential queenside expansion. Establishing immediate central dominance, white plants a pawn firmly, aiming to seize crucial space and dictate the game's early tempo. Challenging the center immediately, this thrust immediately creates tactical possibilities and demands a clear plan from white. Securing the center and preparing for development, this tempo gain adds pressure to black's structure. Instantly creating diagonal pressure, this bishop targets the knight, forcing white to address the pawn's structure's integrity and potential mating threats. Advancing the pawn initiates a space grab, pushing black's bishop onto a less active diagonal, and initiating a pawn chain that promises future positional pressure. Challenging the center directly, black seeks to undermine white's pawn chain and open lines for their pieces. Probing black's queenside development with an ambitious pawn thrust, seeking to disrupt their natural piece placement. Exchanging the bishop here offers a doubled pawn, but relinquishes development advantage, opening a path for white's king. Opening that queenside pawn structure for white creates immediate dynamic possibilities, trading off black's active bishop for a more solid but doubled pawn setup, which could prove a target later. Developing the knight to e7 immediately addresses the awkward central pawn chain, aiming to challenge white's e5 outpost and potentially prepare, and c6 to contest the d4 square. This maneuver subtly redeems the earlier exchange of the bishop, as the knight now actively participates in the fight for central control. Developing the knight to its most active square, f3, prepares for castling and supports a central pawn structure, while also eyeing potential kingside attacks. Challenging white's central pawn advance, black repositions the queen to eye potential weaknesses and prepare for a kingside assault. This dynamic shift introduces immediate tactical possibilities. Prioritizing development, white intends to connect the rooks and activate the bishop on the queenside, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure under indirect pressure. Probing into the center with a pawn push, black aims to restrict white's queenside development and gain a foothold on the d5 square, potentially leading to a pawn chain that controls key central squares. Securing the queenside pawns while simultaneously creating an outpost for the knight on a4 presents a fascinating strategic dilemma, forcing black to confront the newfound spatial advantage head-on. Challenging the advanced pawn structure, the knight boldly ventures to d7, seeking active participation and preparing to support the c4 pawn's advance, aiming to disrupt white's queenside space advantage. Developing the bishop to e2 aims to secure the kingside, preparing for a potential castling maneuver and solidifying white's pawn structure. Even though it might seem passive, it's a prudent step to avoid immediate tactical skirmishes on the queenside while subtly reinforcing white's central claims against black's ambitious pawn advances. A knight ventures to the flank, eyeing the d5 outpost and preparing a queenside expansion, potentially aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Securing the monarch immediately addresses the latent dangers, preparing to deploy pieces from the queenside and assert dominance over the open b-file. Grabbing that knight seems tempting, but it opens up a Pandora's box of positional headaches for black. That pawn on a4 is now a huge target, and white's pieces are itching to exploit the open lines that will inevitably arise. You've essentially traded a potentially useful bishop for a pawn, creating a significant long-term structural weakness. Consider how white's queenside will activate, putting pressure on your weakened pawn chain. The knight on a4, though momentarily occupying valuable space, becomes isolated and a target for swift counterplay. While it's currently a pawn up, the cost in terms of piece activity and defensive integrity is immense. This is a classic example of sacrificing long-term positional advantage for immediate and likely transient material gain. Launching a knight to the rim often signals a desire to disrupt the opponent's pawn chain or embark on a daring knight maneuver. Here, white aims to pressure the advanced c4 pawn indirectly while eyeing the kingside, a bold decision given the knight's current outpost on a4. Initiating development of the knight to a more active square aiming to potentially influence the kingside or redeploy towards the center. This piece now eyes the f4 and h4 squares, offering a flexible option that doesn't immediately commit to a pawn exchange or a risky pawn grab. Opening up the h-file for your knight exchange is a bold gambit, instantly aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure after black's pawn push. This sequence sacrifices a minor piece for a potent initiative and forces a positional reckoning. Opening the h-file for your rook dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a dynamic imbalance. While you've gained an open file, the doubled pawns on the g and h files present structural weaknesses that white might exploit later, particularly if the center locks up. Shifting the rook to the open file immediately offers a more active presence, aiming to exploit the suddenly exposed king position that arose after black's capture and recapture. Developing the bishop to this square aims to solidify the queenside pawns and potentially unblock the c8 square for future maneuvers. However, it might be a touch too passive, allowing white to continue building pressure on the kingside and possibly exploit the open g-file. Think about how this bishop can become more active and participate in the struggle for central control or to threaten white's king. Consider the potential for creating counterplay rather than just reacting to white's initiatives. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal presence, this maneuver aims to activate the piece on a more influential square, potentially contributing to future queenside pressure or providing defensive support should black's initiative spill over. Black seeks to establish a firm foothold on the queenside, creating immediate pressure and potentially opening lines for their pieces. This pawn thrust is a bold assertion of space, aiming to lock down white's queenside expansion and create a new avenue for counterplay. The advance on b5 dynamically challenges white's recent pawn capture on a4, forcing a reaction and potentially dictating the next few exchanges. It's a move designed to disrupt white's coordination, particularly that of the knight on h4, which now looks somewhat misplaced. Black is actively working to generate threats and prevent white from consolidating their position. By pushing the b-pawn, black is not only seeking to gain territory, but also to disrupt the otherwise solid pawn structure white achieved after capturing on c3. This could lead to a dynamic middle game where black has the initiative on the queen side. White marshals queen and rook to pressure the king side, aiming to exploit the open h-file and potentially coordinate an attack against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Focusing on the d-file, this maneuver prepares to contest it, potentially opening lines for counterplay against white's somewhat exposed king, while aiming to solidify black's queenside pawn structure. Securing the b-file with the rook offers white immediate pressure and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece maneuvering on that flank, simultaneously restricting black's queenside expansion. Black shifts the queen to a more passive square, a decision that grants white additional breathing room to develop and coordinate their pieces effectively, potentially reinforcing the a4 pawn or preparing for a queenside advance. Consolidating the bishop's position after the pawn storm creates a more stable defensive setup for white, preparing to weather black's queenside expansion. Black initiates a queenside expansion, seeking to unlock the file and potentially activate the rook on b8, a promising maneuver aimed at creating counterplay against white's somewhat cramped position, especially on the queenside where white's doubled pawns on the c-file present a potential weakness. White opens a vital diagonal for the bishop, preparing to pry open lines on the queenside and potentially launch an attack against black's somewhat exposed king by exploiting the weak pawn structure that resulted from black's capture on c3. The rook's repositioning to b6 attempts to leverage the queenside pawns for potential counterplay and to add pressure along the b-file, though it does leave the king somewhat exposed to potential future threats on the kingside once the central tension resolves. The queen's reroute to g3 aims to exploit the slightly exposed white king and prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, but it also leaves the a4 pawn vulnerable. Black abandons the advanced queenside majority, repositioning the queen to a more defensive posture while preparing to reinforce the d7 knight's position. Strategically repositioning the bishop to the 6th rank offers an imposing presence, directly challenging black's defensive structure and seeking to restrict their queenside activity by controlling key diagonals. Sacrificing the exchange offers immediate pawn material for a significant disruption of White's queenside pawn structure, potentially opening lines towards White's potentially exposed king, though it invites a forceful positional answer. Finally, White seizes the central pawn, opening the e-file for potential rook activity and resolving the lingering pawn structure on the kingside. This bold capture transforms the pawn majority into a dangerous central force and introduces a strategic dilemma for Black: how to salvage the exposed king and develop an effective counterplay against White's suddenly more cohesive setup. The game pivots here, demanding careful calculation from Black to avoid being overwhelmed by White's initiative. The c6 square now becomes a critical outpost for the bishop, a solid anchor in this dynamically unbalanced position, aiming to contest the d6 pawn and potentially disrupt White's pawn chain. Solidifying the pawn structure takes priority now, preventing any immediate infiltrations by Black's knights and creating a more resilient defense around the king. Acknowledging the necessity of the monarch's sanctuary, this maneuver strategically relocates the king to a more secure position, away from the open central files and potential threats lurking on the queenside. The king's safety is paramount, especially given the current pawn structure and the bishop pair Black still possesses. By shifting to d7, the king is no longer directly exposed to the discovered attack possibilities after an e5 pawn push, while also preparing to support potential queenside counterplay should the opportunity arise. Bringing the rook back to the central file opens up the potential for a coordinated assault on Black's somewhat exposed king, while simultaneously reinforcing the e-file, a crucial conduit for future operations. Unveiling a stunning tactical geometry, this audacious queen sortie immediately interrogates White's uncastled king, threatening a swift checkmate on h2 and forcing a defensive reckoning with the exposed monarch. Disrupting the adversary's nascent queenside expansion with this centralizing queen maneuver, White aims to exploit the compromised pawn structure that Black has so carefully constructed. Securing that queen on f6 injects a much-needed sense of active defense, simultaneously challenging White's powerful queen and creating a subtle outpost for the Black monarch to potentially shelter behind. Re-establishing central pressure, the queen pivots to a more active diagonal, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed Black king and potentially create threats along the third rank. Unleashing the rook to the fourth rank offers fresh attacking possibilities, potentially menacing the White king once other pieces join the assault. Reinforcing the rook's advance offers a pragmatic defense of the d6 pawn, yet it implicitly concedes the initiative, allowing Black's queen to penetrate deeper into White's territory and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the king. The rook's bold advance to f4, forking the queen and bishop, ignites immediate tactical possibilities, forcing White to reckon with its doubled pawns on the queenside and the exposed king. A cautious repositioning of the bishop aims to prepare for a potential knight sortie to the central squares, seeking to disrupt Black's growing pawn chain while also offering some protection to the vulnerable e-pawn. A bold gambit is offered, sacrificing a queen for what appears to be a desperate attempt to generate some counterplay against White's imposing central pawn structure and king's safety, forcing White to defend meticulously. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal offers a subtle yet crucial shift in the battle for central influence and potential attack preparation. It's a move that emphasizes White's commitment to consolidating control and preparing for future pawn breaks or piece maneuvers. By positioning the bishop here, White simultaneously defends the e-pawn and eyes the d6 square, which could become a target later, or perhaps prepare a future advance. This piece placement can also be seen as a way to prevent Black's queen from easily accessing more aggressive squares, or as a prelude to activating the rook on the f-file if the opportunity arises. The quiet repositioning aims to improve piece harmony and await Black's next strategic decision, perhaps hinting at a long-term positional advantage. Carving a new path through the crowded queenside pawn structure, this advance seeks to unravel White's defenses by creating dynamic imbalances and potentially opening lines for Black's rooks. Sacrificing the queen here is a bold gambit to disrupt Black's rapidly developing queenside initiative, and potentially exploit the exposed black king. The immediate consequence is the removal of a powerful attacking piece for black, but it also creates a stark imbalance of material, leaving white with a significant pawn deficit. The strategic aim must be to leverage the resulting open lines, particularly the semi-open h-file, and black's potentially awkward pawn structure after hx g6. White needs to actively coordinate their remaining pieces to press on the king and prevent black from consolidating their pawn majority. This transition into an endgame, even with fewer pawns, requires precise calculation and a clear plan to exploit any structural weaknesses black might present. The success hinges on white's ability to generate counterplay and avoid being slowly squeezed by black's extra material. The doubled pawns on the c-file, a lingering consequence of white's earlier pawn grab, are now severely restricting black's queenside expansion, transforming the pawn chain into a defensive wall rather than an attacking spearhead. Clearing the back rank for the rook allows for a more active rook presence, though the structural damage from the pawn storm on the queenside now presents a lingering weakness. The exchange of queens has simplified the position, but black's king is now exposed and lacks adequate defenders. Relocating the rook to this square allows for better defense of the vulnerable monarch. Initiating a pawn chain break, this maneuver aims to exploit the queenside weaknesses created by black's earlier pawn advances, opening lines for your rook and potentially forcing concessions. Opening up the file dramatically alters the strategic landscape, creating immediate threats and forcing a reevaluation of piece placement. This repositioning of the rook to the open b-file intends to contest control, potentially targeting the isolated pawns on the queenside and creating an avenue for activity as the position transitions towards an endgame. Securing the rook on its present position may seem passive, but it subtly prepares for a potential breakthrough, aiming to exploit the open c-file and create new attacking avenues. The pawn push on the kingside immediately opens up lines, a bold gambit to initiate activity even as the queens are off the board, and with it, a shift towards an endgame where pawn structure becomes paramount. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank aims to create a powerful outpost and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure, but it overlooks the immediate danger of white's advancing kingside pawns, which could soon threaten the black king with a constricted escape route. Seeking to shelter the monarch from potential threats, this repositioning prepares a safer haven for the king, aiming to solidify defensive structures as the game ventures into its later stages. Unlocking the king's central potential, the black monarch embarks on a daring journey, seeking to activate its dormant power in the heart of the board. Opening the g-file now aims to exploit the exposed black king, creating potential mating threats or forcing further concessions. The knight's daring excursion to c3 aims to disrupt white's rook-doubled coordination on the 7th rank and potentially create outposts, but it leaves the piece somewhat exposed and might overextend if not adequately supported later. Initiating rook activity on the open file, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's consolidated pawn structure, forcing them to defend or react, thereby potentially creating weaknesses in their camp. Rethinking the knight's purpose, the black knight embarks on a remarkable journey, seeking to destabilize white's queenside structure by repositioning towards the vital c3 square. Unleashing the rook to the center of the board aims to challenge black's suddenly active knight and prepare for a potential pawn storm on the kingside, though it also exposes the white king to more scrutiny. Unleashing the rook towards the queenside initiates a bold maneuver, aiming to create dynamic play and potentially exploit white's pawn structure after the recent exchanges. It's a provocative bid for activity, hoping to outmaneuver the opponent's more passive pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and create mating threats against the exposed monarch. The pawn thrust advances, creating a potentially problematic barrier on the kingside, but simultaneously weakening the dark squares around the black king and demanding immediate attention. Initiating a purposeful journey for the monarch, this king move subtly seeks sanctuary, aiming to escape the disruptive pressure along the now open g-file and find a safer haven behind the advancing pawns, a prudent preparation for the inevitable endgame maneuvers. The rook ventures to the second rank, aiming to destabilize white's kingside pawn structure and potentially create threats along the now open, a file. Initiating a positional regrouping, this bishop maneuvers to g4, eyeing the queenside pawns while also offering potential support for future pawn advances, particularly aiming to disrupt black's burgeoning pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses for exploitation.